Okay, so we're going to start talking in this chapter, chapter 22, about the scientific revolution, which began in the 1500s, and we're going to end up at the end of the chapter with the American Revolution in the late 1700s. So a lot of big, huge changes happening in politics, in science, and knowledge, in art and culture, and it all begins with this scientific revolution in the 1500s. So why is this a revolution? Why is this such a big idea? Why are we looking at this scientific revolution? Well, it is a new way of thinking about the world. And what's new about it is that it's based on two things: direct observation and experimentation. And what does that mean? And how is that different from what came before? Well, prior to the scientific revolution, prior to the 1500s, through most of the Middle Ages and until you get to the Renaissance, if people wanted to know anything about the world around them, and this is the physical world, so the planets, the stars, the trees, the birds, the way the seasons changed or the flow of the tides, all of that stuff that we associate with science, with nature, if you wanted to know anything about it in the Middle Ages, you went to two sources: either the Bible or Greek and Roman texts, classical Greek and Roman ideas. The Bible, of course, being the most important. So if you're a philosopher in the Middle Ages, in the 12 or 1300s, and you want to know why something happens in the world, you go to the Bible for your answer. And if the Bible doesn't give you enough of an answer, you consult an ancient Greek or Roman text. And of course, with the Renaissance, there's a lot more Greek and Roman texts around now to consult, and that was how you got all your information. Well, people in the scientific revolution were no longer satisfied with relying on those two sources. Instead, they wanted to figure things out for themselves. So they would go out and directly observe things in nature. They would do consistent, accurate, detailed observations of what they saw around them, and then they would conduct experiments. Okay? So they would go and try to figure it out by conducting a variety of different experiments, testing out different theories, and this is the essence of the scientific revolution: this shift in thought from relying on these other sources to now going and getting the information yourself using this very precise, careful process to find information. Okay? And the scientific revolution begins, as we see here, in the field of astronomy. And why astronomy? Well, this is also the great age of exploration. Now, we skipped those chapters in the textbook, but if you think about Columbus in 1492, sailing the ocean blue, this is the time period when Europeans are venturing out and exploring the rest of the world. They're going across the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, they're discovering new lands and continents, and the main method of navigation during this time period is the stars. And so they needed accurate charts of the movements of the stars and planets so that they could correctly determine their location at sea. And as more and more observations are being made of the night sky and more detailed observations, they're starting to discover a lot of problems with the old medieval view of the universe. So in the Middle Ages, people thought that the Earth was the center of the universe and the sun and the planets revolved around the Earth. And this idea was put forth by Aristotle and many ancient Greek thinkers. It's implied in the Bible. It was accepted by the Catholic Church. So this is kind of the idea. The Earth is the center. It's the geocentric theory. Well, starting with Copernicus in the 1500s, you get some astronomers and philosophers who begin seeing inconsistencies, contradictions in this view, because what they see in the night sky and the movements of the planets and stars isn't matching up with what was being talked about in the Middle Ages. And Copernicus is the first person to put forth this theory that the sun is actually in the center of the universe and the planets and everything else are revolving around the sun. And this is the new heliocentric theory. Now, for Copernicus, this really was just a theory. It was an idea that he put forth. He didn't really have a lot of concrete evidence to back it up. He had some observations he had done. He was proposing this as a way to solve some of the problems with previous ideas about the universe, but he didn't have any way to prove it. And that comes along with people like Kepler, Galileo, and Newton. What those three together do is develop the rules and the laws and the mathematical formula that prove the heliocentric theory to be correct. Kepler and Galileo develop laws of motion that show how the planets can be moving around the sun, and of course Newton, as you probably all know, with his theory of gravity, explains why everything in the universe is in motion. That force of gravity, which is attracting everything and pulling everything towards everything else, is what keeps the planets in their orbits moving around. Okay? So these guys really get the ball rolling with the scientific revolution. And then you have two interesting people, Francis Bacon and René Descartes. And Bacon is from England, Descartes is from France. And they helped develop what we think of today as our modern scientific method, which you see over here sort of highlighted. This is kind of one version. You probably see it in different forms. You might be using a different variation of this in your science classes when you do experiments. But it's this basic idea of starting off with a problem or a question that you need to resolve. You know, why do the planets move around the sun? You form a hypothesis, right, which is an educated guess at why that is the case, and then you test it through experiments, through observations, you analyze your data, you look at the results, and then you figure out whether your initial idea that you proposed earlier is correct, and if not, you start all over again. And this method that Bacon and Descartes advocated and helped to really solidify during the 15 and 1600s would then lead to all of these other advances in so many different fields: chemistry, physics, medicine, incredible achievements based on these ideas of this scientific method, this consistent, precise way of going about this process of gaining knowledge. Okay, so this chart right here sums up some of the different individuals that we just talked about and their contributions and when they took place. And of course, here is Copernicus, right, who first proposes this sun-centered theory of the universe, or heliocentric, right, from the Greek word helios for the sun. Okay? And then Tycho Brahe, Johannes Kepler, they calculate the planetal orbits, they provide the data and the information that supports Copernicus' view. And then, of course, as you get to Galileo and Isaac Newton, with their laws of motion and gravity, they further prove that idea. And of course, here's Bacon and Descartes, who developed the scientific method. And then Robert Boyle, who is also mentioned in your textbook, is really important because he takes that scientific method and uses it to begin figuring out the different components that make up our natural world, which will eventually lead to the modern science of chemistry. So just to kind of give you a sense, as a kind of quick overview of what was so radical about Copernicus and Kepler's idea, here is the ancient Greek astronomer Ptolemy, who you may remember from section 5 of chapter 5, back when you did those presentations. Ptolemy was one of those Hellenistic scientists, and Ptolemy made observations and concluded that the Earth was at the center of the universe, and the sun and everything else revolved around the Earth. And this made sense to Ptolemy at the time, because he didn't have a whole lot of advanced observations and data to work with. But then as we get to Copernicus, we see this theory proposed of the sun in the center and the planets going around the sun. And then, of course, Kepler figures out how the orbits look and how they should be configured, and he does this using mathematics, and math was a really important part of the scientific revolution. As knowledge of mathematics grew, people were able to use it to solve many of these problems in science. So here is Galileo. This is a very famous painting showing Galileo standing before the Inquisition, the church court. And an important point to make here is that the Catholic Church really wasn't sure how to respond to the scientific revolution. Okay? Initially, the church was, open to debating some of these new ideas, but with all the warfare taking place in Europe, all the religious divisions, the Protestant Reformation, the church gradually became less accepting of new views, especially since the ideas of, Copernicus and Galileo really challenged some of the fundamental teachings of the Catholic Church. And Galileo was eventually, when he was an old man, put on trial by the church for proposing ideas that supported Copernicus' idea of a sun-centered universe, which contradicted what the church taught at that time. Remember, the church backed the earth-centered idea of the universe. Galileo was fortunate in that, unlike a lot of other people who challenged the church, he wasn't, he wasn't executed after his trial, but he was essentially made a prisoner. The difference here is that because of the printing press, because of the changes that had happened since the Renaissance, despite the church's best efforts, they could not stop Galileo's ideas from spreading. And so even though he's put on trial and essentially imprisoned by the church, his ideas spread out to a wide audience that can now have access to books and can read because of the printing press, and this will be a major factor that helps the scientific revolution really spread and succeed. Okay, so moving on from the scientific revolution, we get the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment picks up from the scientific revolution in the 1600s and lasts all the way into the 1700s and early 1800s. And the Enlightenment is an intellectual movement, and its main focus is in Europe, but it also spreads over here to America, to both North and South America. And the Enlightenment is really inspired by the scientific revolution, in particular the ideas of Newton. And why is this the case? Well, if you remember, with his law of gravity, Newton was able to explain basically why things happen in the natural world. So he provided a rational, logical explanation for what was happening in the world around us using these ideas of science and mathematics. And so what a lot of philosophers and intellectuals in Europe in the 16 and 1700s want to do is they want to take that scientific method we saw in the previous slide, that logical process, and instead of applying it to the world of nature, they want to now apply it to human society and all aspects of human society. So they want to apply it to government, to religion, to economics, to law, to all the different things that make our society work. Okay? And the Enlightenment really reached its height in Paris and France in the 1700s. And this idea of taking the scientific method and applying it to humankind, was really appealing to these people. And they thought that by doing this, they would improve people's minds, they would make better politics, better governments, better economic systems. They would be bringing the light, which is where we get the Enlightenment from, they would be bringing the light of reason and science to a world where there was really still a lot of ignorance and superstition and violence and poverty, and they were going to try to fix a lot of these social problems. In many ways, even today, we're still living with the legacy of the Enlightenment and that belief, that desire to use science as a way to solve problems of human society. Now over here on the right, you can see some of these key Enlightenment ideas listed out here. And you notice that it starts off with this idea about the ability to reason. The Enlightenment really emphasized reason. In many books you see this period referred to as the Age of Reason, because they thought our ability to think was the thing that really set us apart and gave us the ability to solve a lot of the problems that we had in the world. If we just took time to logically and rationally think about these problems, we could fix them. And so the hope with the Enlightenment was that through this promotion of reason, they could end ignorance, superstition, and also stop unfair government. And that was a key part of what the Enlightenment wanted, was reform in government. Okay? And part of this whole thing came out of the scientific revolution, right? They saw that the natural world, the world of nature, of planets and stars and trees and the tides, is all governed by laws. And those laws, like the law of gravity, we could figure out through the use of reason and mathematics. So here's again that idea of taking that next step and saying, well, if nature follows these rules, so must human behavior in society. And then the final key point was that government, right? The government should reflect what we learn from applying that scientific method to human society. So speaking of government, one of the most important Enlightenment philosophers was this fellow John Locke, who was around in the 1600s. And John Locke is probably one of the single most influential thinkers and philosophers in history. And his ideas about politics and government were especially important, because John Locke, using reason and logical analysis, argued that all human beings are innately born with what he termed natural rights. Okay? And according to Locke, those three rights were life, liberty, and property. Okay? We all had the right to our life. Nobody could take our life away from us without our consent, without giving them a just reason for doing so. Everyone had liberty. You had the freedom to act in any way you wanted, as long as you didn't restrict the liberty of somebody else. And you had your right to property. And this is really important, because what John Locke meant by property was that you had an innate, inherent, inner right to possess all the things that you produced through your labor and hard work. So, if you're a farmer or you're a merchant, whatever you gain through your activity, through your effort, is yours to keep. And nobody can take that away from you without your consent, without your agreement. And if those three things look very familiar to you, they should. Because later on, Thomas Jefferson, when he writes the Declaration of Independence, will talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which to people at the time of the American Revolution, pursuit of happiness meant being able to acquire wealth and property without a lot of interference from the government, which, if you think about it, was the big complaint in the American Revolution, that the British government was, by taxing the people, taking away their wealth and their property and not really giving them an opportunity to have their voices heard about that. So Locke argued that a government's purpose was to protect those natural rights. So those rights came before government, which meant that government can't take those rights away from you. Instead, its job is only to protect them. And if the government did try to take those rights away from you, and this is the key point, Locke said you could overthrow that government. You had a right to revolt against a government that failed to protect your rights. And this would also be a very important inspiration for a lot of the people in the American Revolution when they went up against the British government. So Locke and a lot of these other thinkers, especially the people in France, during the Enlightenment were known as philosophes, which is just the French word for philosophers. And many of your great Enlightenment thinkers did come from France. And these philosophes called for reforms in every aspect of society. But three things in particular they advocated for: freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and religious toleration. In Europe at this time, speech and press were often restricted by the government. What these philosophes wanted was people to have the ability and the right to say and express whatever they wanted without interference from the government. And of course, religious toleration. The philosophes really opposed the past history of the Catholic Church and even the Protestants with their religious intolerance, their desire to kill or injure those who disagreed. The philosophes said that an enlightened person is willing to listen to all points of view and should tolerate all religions. Some of the major philosophes you see listed down here: Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Rousseau. They're also over here in this chart on the side, so you can get some of their basic ideas. Montesquieu is important because he brings back those ideas we saw in ancient Rome of a separation of powers and checks and balances, that a government or power was divided up among different groups, and those groups could check and balance each other, was the best type of government. Voltaire was a big advocate of freedom of speech, and Rousseau would become really important during the French Revolution. Some of his ideas about democracy and government would really have a strong influence on the people that launched the French Revolution. So how does the Enlightenment spread? How do these ideas that develop in the 1700s reach a larger audience? Well, there's several different ways. First, it's through writing. And one of the big things is the encyclopedia, and you see it depicted down here in these illustrations. The encyclopedia was the brainchild of Denis Diderot, who was a French philosopher and thinker who wanted to bring together all of the new knowledge of the time period and make it accessible to people. So this encyclopedia, which you see here, contained all the information that they had developed during this time period, new ideas about politics and agriculture and government, right? So that people would have access to it. Now, the encyclopedia was still very expensive, and really only people in the upper middle class and upper class could afford it, but it was a start. For people who were poorer, the way that they got access to Enlightenment ideas was through books, pamphlets, and newspapers, and these would help to spread some of these Enlightenment ideas to other folks. Another method, especially for the upper class, were the salons, and these were meetings in the homes of wealthy women, especially in Paris and other cities in France, where a lot of the great intellectuals and artists and musicians would gather together to discuss and debate their new ideas. And you would leave the salon and then go to your town or to your city or to your village and bring those ideas with you and share them with the people there, and this also helped it to spread. Art and music was another effective way to spread the values and ideas of the Enlightenment. We'll look at a couple examples of what was called neoclassical art in a few minutes. And then enlightened despots. So there were some rulers during this time period who really tried to adopt some of the Enlightenment ideas in their nations, and in that way they also helped spread the values of the Enlightenment to their people. So when we look at the impact of the Enlightenment and the effect that it had on Western civilization, there's sort of four main results or long-term effects of the Enlightenment. The first is that it really helped to inspire the American and French revolutions. When we look at those two revolutions in upcoming units, we'll see all over the influence of the Enlightenment ideas, particularly, like we saw before, the ideas of John Locke in the American Revolution and the ideas of Rousseau in the French Revolution. The Enlightenment also furthered this belief in progress, which started with the Renaissance. This idea that through education, through the use of the scientific method, we could have progress. We could make society and the world around us better over time. And that's an idea that really didn't get challenged until the 20th century and we get to World War I and World War II. Up until that point in time, this Enlightenment faith in our ability to improve the world around us was really strong. It also continued that emphasis on the individual that began with the Renaissance, people starting to think more about their own individual views rather than think of themselves as part of some larger group. And also, like the Renaissance, the Enlightenment continued to promote this secular outlook by promoting science and reason and challenging a lot of superstitions and a lot of ideas and religion. The Enlightenment fed into this trend of people starting to have less and less faith in religion. So, of course, one of the big products of Enlightenment thought is the American Revolution, which starts in 1775 and will end in 1783 with the defeat of Great Britain and freedom for the 13 American colonies who will become the United States of America. And although there were a lot of complex economic and social and political factors that helped bring about the American Revolution, it was also really strongly influenced by the ideas of the Enlightenment. In particular, when the British American colonists got angry with all the taxes that were being imposed on them by the British government and what they thought were abuses of power by the British government, they really referred to a lot of Enlightenment thought, especially the ideas of John Locke, to justify the revolt against the British government. And all throughout our two main documents, the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution, we see the impact of these Enlightenment ideas. We already looked at how the Declaration of Independence draws heavily on John Locke. The United States Constitution really draws heavily on the ideas of thinkers like Montesquieu, with that separation of powers and the checks and balances. It also draws heavily on the ideas of Rousseau and Voltaire, talking about democracy and the rights of the people, and that those rights shouldn't be taken away by the government. So these documents in many ways reflect those Enlightenment ideas. So to flesh out some of the things we just looked at in that last slide, this is a very famous painting or image showing a salon, in this case one of the ones in Paris, France, run by this woman right here, Madame Geoffrin, and she would invite all of these great artists and scholars and musicians to come to her house and to gather and discuss and debate their ideas. And this was a very important way that the Enlightenment ideas spread among the middle and upper classes. And like I said, art was also a powerful tool for spreading the ideas of the Enlightenment. So here, for example, is the painting The Death of Socrates by Jacques-Louis David. David was a French painter, probably one of the best painters of the Enlightenment period, and he was really a promoter of a style called neoclassical. And if you think of neo as new, classical referring to ancient Greece and Rome, what neoclassic art tried to do was use images and ideas from ancient Greece and Rome to promote the ideas and beliefs of the Enlightenment. So, of course, in this case, we see here Socrates about to drink the hemlock potion that will kill him. This is after he's been put on trial by the people of Athens and sentenced to death. And you see Socrates surrounded by his students. So we have a scene here from ancient Greece, but it's being used to convey an Enlightenment idea. And that idea is that you should stand up for what you believe, you should challenge accepted views and authorities, which is what Socrates did, even if it means the sacrifice of your own life. Now, other neoclassical art really celebrated the scientific revolution and how science was going to improve life for everyone. So we see here in this painting by Joseph Priestley, an English artist, we see these people gathered around a scientific device. You see the children, eagerly leaning in to learn from that device and study nature and learn from these new ideas. So this art would have a powerful influence on people promoting the new ideas of the scientific revolution. As I mentioned before, another way that these Enlightenment ideas spread was through these so-called enlightened despots or rulers. And these are people like Frederick, Joseph, and Catherine, who are all described in the Reading for Your SOTAC packet. They were the rulers of Austria, Prussia, and Russia, and they tried to implement some of these Enlightenment ideas in their nations. They got rid of torture and punishments that were now seen as barbaric and irrational. In Europe in the 1700s, you could be executed for a relatively minor crime, especially in these countries, and so these rulers tried to do away with that. They promoted education in their nations, so they established schools so that people could be trained in these new scientific ideas, which would then make their country stronger because they have more educated people. And then these rulers, to varying degrees, tried to promote religious toleration and give a little bit more freedom of speech and freedom of the press to people living in their country. Now, of course, there were limits on how far these rulers would go, because they still wanted to make sure that the people were obedient and followed what they said, but they at least attempted to implement some of these ideas. Now, Joseph II was the most successful and far-reaching reformer. He made dramatic changes in Austria, but unfortunately after he died, a lot of those reforms were taken away by the nobility. Frederick the Great was considered to be an amazing enlightened ruler who promoted a lot of reforms. Catherine the Great, even though she was loved by a lot of the French philosophers, really didn't ultimately pass that many reforms. So she loved the Enlightenment, she liked to talk about the ideas, but probably of the three, put the fewest of its beliefs into practice in her country in Russia.